All right, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Um, I'm excited to be here and do this month's webinar for what is shaping up to be a really great program. We're thrilled, both Dr. Gwynn and I, to be a part of the Milton team. So if there are other cities that are current recipients of the grants on the line, we're excited to be a part of this whole community. And to be able to work with Milton on a project that I'm not going to talk about today, but you'll hear much more about in the months to come. So today we're going to talk about transportation and multimodal transportation specifically. And the thing is, the way that we've been doing transportation for some time now has created a lot of problems in our communities. Oops, this is where. There we go. One of them is this, and another one is this, and another one is this. These first two pictures, the first one may look familiar, the third one may look familiar, and the second you may have laughed at because you've never seen a sign like that, but you know exactly what it's referring to. To put a little bit of data to some of these photos that I'm showing, in several government agencies have done reports looking at things like per capita emissions of CO2 from transport. And the amazing part is that that drastically differs from one city to another. And as you can see on this graph, the names are a little bit small. But if you can't quite read it, that very tall annual kilograms per capita of CO2 amount on the left side is our home city of Atlanta. And when you compare that to lots of very livable places with high GDP per capita and such, we're literally 3 to 4 times higher than some of those places. And a big part of that is this ratio on the side of public to private transportation. So as we have really auto-centric places, we tend to have much higher emissions, thus our first picture. In addition, when we tend to have really auto-centric places, they tend to have more traffic fatalities. So this is a graph showing a bunch of different cities around the world broken into residents of more than 500,000 versus less than 500,000. And you can see that as there are more transit trips per capita, the traffic fatalities per 100,000 residents go down. So places are safer as well, which wasn't one of my photos, but the congestion photo could kind of lead you in that direction, as well as some of the other impacts of congestion. And one of the other big ones is this last one, thinking about that sign with the obese Americans trying to cross the road. The risk of obesity increases 6% with every additional hour spent per day commuting in a car. And so we can directly correlate some of our public health problems that have been happening for a long time in the US with the way that we get around in urban and all of our communities. So you can see that there's a lot of problems in that transportation, the way that we do it today, causes. So what I'm going to try to convince you of for the first couple minutes of my talk is why it is that we need to be more multimodal. That's kind of what the last few slides were about, that the more we're in a car, the more obese we're going to be. The more we take transit, the less traffic fatalities we might have. The more we do things that are going to reduce emissions, the more we are in public transportation or shared transportation, the more we'll reduce our emissions. So a long time ago for some of us, there was an individual who wrote a book called All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And I love to use this book as a way to introduce one particular concept because as a professor, someone who teaches college students, I love to be able to tell people that you really have all the skills that you need in life already from your kindergarten class. It's great that you come to places like Georgia Tech to refine these skills, but you learned it long, long ago, if only we could just remember. And there's some of the things on his list that are particularly particularly tied to the world of transportation, like number 13, when you go out in the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands, and stick together. How about some other ones like clean up your own mess? There's a lot of bigger picture things we could think of in that. But his number one thing on this list of all the things that you need to know that you long ago learned was that we should share everything. That in his list includes, paste and crayons. But in our world, it refers to things like the sharing economy. So the sharing economy refers to these systems that enable shared access to goods, services, data, and talent. And the way that we do this is we leverage information technology to reuse excess capacity in goods and services. And so there's a lot of things that we own or use where we're only using a small portion of the capacity of that good or that service. And if we can only use technology to fill that service better, that's really what the sharing economy is all about. And you can imagine in the transportation world, when we look at my congestion picture, I'm sure you're all thinking, oh, yes, of course, there's tons of excess capacity there. But we need to look at that picture a little bit differently. So now let me hammer home my point of why multimodal transportation is the direction that we have to be going by showing you this image to talk about why shared transportation is important. That congestion picture is pretty similar to the one on the left here. That, as we are all traveling individually in vehicles, there's a lot of excess capacity around us, a lot of wasted space. And if we can figure out ways to share that space, like we do in the bus picture in the middle, or if we can figure out ways that we can right size our vehicles so we're taking up less space, like we do in the bicycle picture on the right, then we can have a much more efficient transportation system. So forget the environmental benefits that I touted, the safety benefits or the public health benefits. Simply a matter of space is there's only so much space and we have to use the space that's available efficiently. And the best way to do so is to be multimodal. Now, this is a talk about technology in transportation. So you may say to yourself, well, aren't there some technologies that are going to solve this problem better than these images that you're showing? So when I say future of transportation, what do you think of? When I give this talk in person, I love to pause for a second and get some answers, but in this format, it's a little hard to do so. So I just want you to think to yourself, how do you think we're going to get around in the next 20 years? Lots of people would point to two things as those items, those revelations that are changing transportation. And the two are self-driving cars and what we in the industry call TNCs that are known to most folks as Uber, Lyft, those types of services. And there's been lots in the news about the fact that, we don't really need mass transit systems because self-driving cars and taxis are going to make transit obsolete, or that Uber and Lyft are out competing transit. So why is it that we need to worry about these things? Micromobility is, competing with the bicycle, all of these types of things, right? But what I'm going to show you is that these things are not actually the be-all and end-all, and that we have to use them in particular ways, just like the transportation system that we have today, if we're going to solve some of these problems that I mentioned. So first, let's talk about driverless vehicles. There's several different possible autonomous futures that we can look towards. The first is personal autonomous vehicle ownership. The second is that we would have some sort of jointly owned system, but it would be single occupant. So some sort of a ride hailing system similar to Uber and Lyft today, but with single occupants. And then finally, a shared usage of these kinds of mobility services, right? And a lot of the stats that you hear about driverless vehicles and how this is going to be an excellent solution for our cities revolve around an assumption that number 3 is actually going to happen. But the truth is that a typical driver under this personal autonomous vehicle situation, a typical driver would only be able to afford one vehicle. It would be sized to usefulness the same way that our vehicles today are. And not only that, but we could, if we have this type of personal autonomous vehicle ownership, we could end up with zero occupant trips. So I want to take my vehicle to Georgia Tech. Parking at Tech is very expensive. So my vehicle drives me in the morning, and then in the afternoon, and then when I get to campus, I send it back to my home where it parks. And then in the afternoon, it comes to get me and then takes me back home again, right? That where there today is 2 single occupant trips, tomorrow there could be not just 2 single occupant trips, but 2 zero occupant trips as well. So the way we overcome that kind of situation is we assume that I'm not going to own my vehicle. The danger in that assumption is that so far, most of the driverless vehicles that are taking off are things like Teslas, where they are independently owned. So we're literally headed down the road of this first scenario. But let's say that we have some sort of regulation that encourages people not to own these vehicles. Let's say something happens in the pricing of them that as they get introduced on a larger scale, that they're not going to be individually owned. Then we would have single occupant ride hailing. But in this situation, we're still going to have vehicles that are circling to wait for pickups. We're going to add passengerless delivery trips, and there's really no incentive in the policies that we have today for those delivery trips to take place in a very efficient manner. If one package is looking to be delivered, then the vehicle can certainly make that trip to deliver that one package. And everything we know about travel demand, which is a field I've worked in for a while now, shows that when we make trips easier, we increase travel. We saw it with the development of the suburbs. So as automobiles came about and made travel easier, people moved outside of cities and increased the amount of travel that they undertook. So there's no reason to say that if we had single occupant ride hailing that, assuming the costs are comparable to what they are today, I might decide to have dinner in Chattanooga because that's where my favorite restaurant is. And so I'm going to work the last hour on my way up there. I'm going to sleep the last hour of my way back. And that trip suddenly is not as onerous as it is today because I have this vehicle that's going to do the trip for me. So what I'm coming down to is that the only way that we can actually make this driverless situation such where there are less trips taking place is shared usage, thus our sharing economy model. And so what this leads to is basically the same picture. When we talk about these alternatives as things, technology-oriented things that are leading us to this fantastic future in transportation, that car picture looks pretty similar if we take into account shared vehicles or if we take into account driverless vehicles. The picture doesn't really change. So how is it then that we use technology in order to change the picture? So my first one, and this is the part where I get into some of the research that we're doing here at Georgia Tech with my group in particular. So our question is, how can we ensure a livable and effective future transportation system using technology, right? And so first I'm going to talk about the transit side of things, some of the projects that we're doing and some of the ways that we have to change how transit operates using technology so that we can have more of a shared model, what I call collective transportation. So I wrote a paper a year or two ago about the future of public transportation and basically what has to occur for people to be willing to use public transportation in larger numbers. And like I said, I don't like to call it public transportation because I think when people say transit, they have a model in their head of what exists today. I would instead call it collective transportation. So how do we actually use these types of vehicles and encourage people to be moving about collectively as opposed to individually, how we do for much of our transportation in the US today. And in this, I made 4 points. That if travel is a utility, mobility must be a service, that spatial priority has to be given to these collective transportation modes, that we, despite my love of technology, that we have to focus first on the service being provided and then on what kind of technology is going to provide it, And then finally, that knowledge is power. So I love to talk about all of these points all of the time, but given the time that we have and the focus for this being a smart communities talk on technology in particular, I'm going to drill down into number 1 and number 4 on this list. So first, if travel is a utility, which is something that we say all the time, we travel to get from one place to another, then mobility must be a service. And if folks on the call that are listening to this talk have never heard of mobility as a service, you need to Google it and find out more. But the basic premise of MOS, or mobility as a service, is that seamless travel has to take place with collective transportation as the backbone. So we need these really high capacity public transportation corridors where the bulk of our travel distances are happening. So we need that collective travel for the efficiency of the system. And then leading into those routes, we have localized services for short trips or for our first mile, last mile connectivity. And those are things that could be micromobility, they could be bikes, they could be walking, they could be something more like a shared Uber or Lyft trip that are connecting into these really high capacity lines to get us somewhere for the bulk of our trip. And that's really the backbone, the idea of mobility as a service. And the other half of it is to transform mobility so that it can be seen more like a high quality utility. So connection from one service to another has to be really, really efficient and pleasant. You have to not think about it. We don't think on a day-to-day basis about how we get our water or how we get our electricity. Those are the kinds of things that they just happen. And that's how transportation has to be as well. But it's that seamless that we don't think about the connection that's taking place. And in order for that to occur, there has to be minimal delay and there has to be really good information available. Which brings me to my second point, the idea that knowledge is power. So one of the best ways that we can use technology to make this kind of vision happen is to have really good information, to use technology to put really good information in the palm of our hands. So if we have technology and data that can tell us about transit systems, about these collective transportation systems, then we're going to be more apt to use them. And they're going to be easy with less delay. There's other things we have to do to discourage that delay. But having information about that delay is really, really important too. However, the use of technology and data have been pretty slow within the public transportation world. And we live in a very information-intense society. So what transit needs to do is inform customers in real time, have open data that is kept updated, where service alerts, things like this are happening as they're occurring, and full information is available. And so service disruption alerts and even ways for customers to be providing feedback, all in one easy to use format. And so I'm going to talk to you about a project that's been ongoing. In the introduction, he alluded to OneBusAway. This is a project that I've been working on for a number of years now, more than a decade. And the whole premise of it is this idea of open data. So open data is really important in this day and age. And what happened, a decade or more ago is that many agencies, transit agencies and lots of others, would have certain data. They would keep that data locked up and they would only put that data out there so that somebody could use it when they got a special request from a developer. So thus our line would be lots of scribbles because there's lots of time and paperwork and difficulty involved with somebody who wants to get access to that data to do research or to develop some sort of app that would access that. And so in the transit world, people would actually do this. They would go to that trouble and they would create something for a very small subset of riders. But what started to happen about a decade ago is that agencies started to open that data up. And now anyone can access that data. And so we could actually create an app like the one we did with OneBusAway, and we could use that over and over again in lots of different cities. And the reason is because we had coded that on top of this open data format where there was data in a standardized format that lots of people could react to. And the one in particular that we work with on OneBusAway and a lot of folks in the transit world use is called the General Transit Feed Specification. This is simply a transit schedule in a very standardized format. And this is pretty important in the transportation world for access to this kind of data. And then in addition to that, there's folks that are working on GTFS real time. So this is giving vehicle positions, trip updates, alerts, things like that, also in a standardized format so that we can consume that from multiple cities at the same time. And there's also tools like OpenStreetMap, free editable maps of the world, so that we can use that as the background to all of these kinds of tools that we're making available. And then in addition to that, I'm one who lives in this shared economy world. All of the projects that we've worked on through OneBusAway and basically everything I'm involved in is all built on open source code. So the whole idea of this is that we're sharing the code behind it so that people can build on the work. Open source products exist in many different fields. WordPress is a blogging platform. There are web browsers, Postgres, MySQL, Tomcat. The definition of open source is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. And so when we created our program to give transit arrivals, we did it all as an open source platform. And to my knowledge, we're the only open source transit real-time information platform that exists to this day. The whole goal of open source is that any agency can use it without a license fee, and adapt it to their specific needs. And this allows different agencies' IT departments to run an installation, outside vendors, independent developers, anybody can actually run an installation. And where we've used this shared resource of open source code is to develop something called OneBusAway. This, like I said, has existed for more than a decade now. It's a series of native apps, iPhone, Android. We've coded other versions as other phones have come along, with an API for developers and all available free to riders. And it's all like the screen on the right, where as you open up, if you've used these kinds of apps before, they're all pretty similar. If you open up that screen, you can look on a particular stop and know when the next couple of bus, train, whatever it is that you're waiting for, when the next couple of arrivals are. We did this to make public transit easier to use, but we also did this because if we're the ones doing it in the research community, then we're able to evaluate what the impacts of this are. And I have a host of projects looking at how real-time information is used by passengers, how it changes your behavior, your willingness to ride, your comfort with those services, and many other metrics. The way that we run OneBusAway is that it's actually a multi-region app, and so there's a centralized server where the apps that we've modified over time are finding the local city that you're in using a directory, and we can add new cities by adding a record in the directory. And so each of our instances are run locally. So the one in Tampa, as an example, is run by the agency, the transit agency there in Tampa, HART in that case. And if somebody's in Tampa using the app, then they can just pull that data from there. If they move to a different community or they happen to be in a different community, then the app would correct itself for the location where they're at. And OneBusAway started in Seattle, where I did my dissertation. Quickly thereafter, we opened it up in New York and Tampa. We actually had an Atlanta instance for a while that's since been shut down. But since that time, it's actually expanded across the US and internationally, with some of our most recent additions being smaller places like Spokane, Washington, but larger places like Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so at this point, we estimate that about 1 million people use this app a day to get real-time arrivals, either via the apps themselves or via some sort of back-end where they're using our APIs and such, but they've developed their own apps locally. What we've done since then, though, is to build on this, the idea that in public transportation, having good information is one thing, being able to do all those things that I said. But in addition to that, we want to be able to use that to improve arrival times for transit vehicles. And there's this phenomena for a lot of transit services about the headways themselves. So we try to keep transit vehicles a certain distance apart so that we can serve riders well. Sometimes we do this via a schedule, but as we get towards more frequent services, we try to run them on headways. So we try to run them every 5 minutes, as an example. The problem is that sometimes, like in this photo, in this image that you see, our first bus gets a little bit ahead, bus number 2 gets a little bit behind, and you can see they're both picking up all of our little passengers at various stops, shown in red. And as bus 2 starts to get a little bit behind, there's more and more passengers ahead of bus 2. And so bus 3 starts to catch up, and bus 2 starts to get behind, until hopefully this never happens. But we definitely have situations where the 2 buses are literally one right in front of the other. And so what we are trying to do is to use the real-time information that's coming through apps like OneBusAway so that we can actually keep the headways between these vehicles as regular as possible. And so part of what my group does is things like developing new algorithms to regulate those headways and hold buses so that using that real-time information, not just from the bus that's hitting a particular terminal station, but all of them along the network. In addition, or the way that we do this is we've partnered with another open source developer called the Transit Clock. This records real-time and historic movements and does prediction algorithms to say when the vehicles are actually going to arrive. So this can be used to connect any sort of GPS device that's on a transit vehicle to apps like OneBusAway that would tell you when the next vehicle is going to arrive. But it can also be used for those kinds of headway management services that I talked about in the last slide. So it provides predictions in these GTFS real-time and another similar format Siri that I alluded to before in the open data part. It also gives different schedule adherence reports, prediction analysis reports, et cetera, et cetera. And the whole goal of this is to have accurate arrival predictions for passengers. We also work with other open source apps that I'm not going to go into, like the Open Trip Planner. And the goal of this is for all of these things to be tied together so that a transit agency can have a complete package in order to have this kind of really, really reliable information available all through open source code instead of proprietary software. A big part of Transit Clock, some of the current developments are things like what you see here. We actually did a test run on the Atlanta streetcar to see if these passenger holding systems can work. And this is a screen that the drivers had when they were looking at whether they should be holding or proceeding on their route. So that's part of it. I talked about the transit half of things and how that's working, how what my group has been doing is to get better information out there and to consume that information in order to do things to improve transit headways. The other half of this is the bike half of things. So I showed you 2 pictures that I think are the ways that we get around a lot of our problems in transportation is multimodally to move collectively. But we can also try to right-size our vehicles. So we can try to use things like bikes. I'm an advocate for walking and other micromobility devices that have a similar footprint. But in particular, my team has worked quite a bit on improving bikeability in cities. So the other way that I'm going to talk about that we can ensure a livable and effective future transportation system is through cycling. And so part of what we're trying to get at is that we have a certain image in our heads of what cycling is in the US, and this picture is not that image. But I often take students on a study abroad class that I lead to the Netherlands, and this was a picture that I took there. I actually saw the woman pull up with the 3 children that you see that are pictured could be on this bike with her. And I wasn't quick enough to get a picture, get my phone out to take a picture before she walked into their elementary school. And I didn't have time to wait around for her to come back out. But I took a picture of her bike itself, and I assure you that it was fully used. So talk about using your capacity well. But the goal is that in the Netherlands, they have a transportation system where they've built it so that people feel comfortable riding a bike like this on a daily basis for most of their transportation needs. And where that comes from is in the US, we talk a bunch, and this is something that our group developed. It was originally a spectrum with a couple of these, and we've added more to it. But we like to think about the population as different rider types. There's folks who are out there today who are biking, who are what we call strong and fearless. So this is the 1% of the population that is willing to bike under any circumstances. They have some sort of a passion for it or an environmental passion where they're going to do it regardless of the environment. Regardless of the environment around them, not the larger environment. But then there's other groups like enthused and confident. These are the folks who'd like to be biking, but with no infrastructure out there, they're not going to do it. If we start to put a few bike lanes and give them some amenities, then they might take it up, but it's still a pretty small portion of the population. But most of the population falls into these other categories: comfortable but cautious, or interested but concerned. And the pictures kind of tell the story here of who we're talking about. And there's, of course, a segment of the population that says, no way, no how, I'm never going to bike. And we actually don't worry about that. That's fine. The goal is to be more multimodal, not to take away any modes, but to enhance it so that we have multiple modes that we could be relying on at any point in time. The goal is to provide people with true choices. And so what we aim for is, how do we design a system for those folks that are comfortable but cautious, or even interested but concerned? So I myself might fall into one of the buckets more towards the left, but when my kids are biking with me, I definitely fall more into the blue shape on our rider type spectrum. And part of the way that we've been looking at this for some time, another researcher who's heavily involved in the Smart Communities program is Chris Ledantic. And Chris and I created an app called Cycle Atlanta. This was based, because open source code is so great, we were able to base this on an app out of San Francisco called Cycle Tracks that already existed. And what we used this for was to track people's trips. We had them download the app and record their trips as they were biking from place to place. And we could use this data in order to get an idea of which roads were people avoiding because clearly they felt uncomfortable. What kind of infrastructure were people going out of their way for? What kinds of people, when we look at that rider spectrum, or when we look at other categories like gender, age, what kinds of people go out of their way to be on more higher quality bike infrastructure? So that was the initial goal of the Cycle Atlanta program, and all of that source code is still available if folks wanted to use the app. We don't maintain it any longer because there's other apps commercially available that are doing similar things at this point. In addition to that, I've done a lot of work on surveys, looking at people's perceptions. So if you live in the Atlanta area, you might have been one of the folks to receive a survey like this that we sent out in mass, asking people with different images if they would feel comfortable, safe, biking on a road like this, or if it's something they try. So here's a little larger version of this image. We showed this in these surveys that we've done using bike lanes, if it's a bike lane with parking adjacent, if there's 2 lanes, and if there's much more what we call protected bike infrastructure. And I'm going to get to more of that in a minute. But part of what we're currently trying to do is not to send this out via surveys. It's a great way to understand the general population. But what we really want to understand is, why is it? What is it about the environment itself that makes you willing to bike in a certain location and not in others? And part of that could be a bike lane, or what we call a protected bike lane, but there could be a lot of other things as well. And so what this comes to is one of the current projects that Chris and I are working on is around the idea of stress. When I say stress, we all think of different things. So you may think of this kind of image or this kind of image. I've definitely had days that felt like this. You may feel like this sometimes. Those are all stressful situations, right? There's these outside pressures, time pressures, performance pressures, other types of things that stress you out. Well, you also might get stressed in a situation like this. So this gentleman looks mildly stressed, but he looks like the kind of person who maybe wouldn't be stressed in this situation. But when we look, most of us, at biking in that kind of situation, it looks like it'd be pretty stressful to me. Or you might look at a situation like this. Is that something that's stressful to you? Maybe less than the previous one, but it's still a lot going on where there's a lot of people making decisions all at the same time, right? And an image like this is one where we're seeing that maybe she's not so stressed at all. That grin on her face, it's a sunny day, she's getting around in a healthy way, and she's riding in what we call a protected bike lane. So this is a bike lane where there's some sort of a barrier between her and the traffic that's going in the same direction. And so that kind of element is what we think. Some of our surveys have shown this is what people prefer if they're actually going to be willing to bike from place to place. But we're trying to use technology to understand every aspect of that trip that she's taking to see where she is or isn't stressed. And the way that we're doing this, there's a lot of different ways that we could measure stress. There are non-invasive ways that we can measure stress. We can look at heart rate variation, breathing patterns, your blood pressure, your skin response, brain waves. A lot of these things are things that involve really, really cumbersome equipment that would have to be mounted to you in some way. Or they're things that when you exert yourself, like you do if you're biking from one place to another, these things are going to change as well. So our current research is actually looking at eye-based measures. We think that eye tracking is one of the most viable measures, and we're likely going to use a combination of different eye tracking measures in order to measure people's stress when they're cycling to try to understand what it is in the environment that stresses them. And so the way that we're doing this currently, this is one of my PhD students, April's work. We're using the Pupil Labs eye tracking equipment. These are the glasses that Pupil Labs have created. And we're using this, we're having people riding from place to place put these on, and then we're able to measure how their eyes are changing, where it is that they're focusing, how their gaze is changing, how fast that gaze is, how much above the horizon is, all of these different types of measures to try to understand how those things change with the amount of stress that they're feeling. In addition to that, Chris, as part of the lab, has worked on creating boxes that have all kinds of different sensors so that we have a box that we can put from bike to bike to understand how the environment around people might be causing those stress levels. So we've got a host of sensors that are in these boxes, including GPS, accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers, as well as different environmental sensors. We've got a separate project where we're measuring things like particulate matter to understand how exposure to particulate matter changes as the bike goes on different types of roadways. And so the whole goal of all of these things is to bring them together to understand the environment that a cyclist is traveling in and what it is in that environment that might be stressing them out. So in some of our initial eye tracking tests, as an example, you can see things like the green dot in these images. The more confident cyclist is looking further on the horizon as opposed to the more timid cyclist who's looking straight down. This is one of the measures that we're looking at. You can see that occurring in different images. So it's those types of things that we're doing with the eye trackers. And then you can see an example of our stress maps. What we do in these tests that we're running is we have people look and wear this eye tracker, and then they complete their ride, and they show us what parts of that ride they felt stressed within. And then we try to see how the data can actually predict where they would be stressed and what the stressors in the environment would be. So in summary, I think I'm close to where Greg wanted me to be time-wise. What my research is about is overcoming barriers to transit and cycling with better information. So I use technology in particular ways to try to enhance transit and cycling to make them true choices so that we can get people to do what I said at the beginning with the collective transportation. We can get people to right-size their vehicles, or we can get people to move about collectively. And in order to do this, we need good sources of data. So I work with communities to help them open up their data. I work with communities to try to crowdsource data that doesn't currently exist. And then we try to use innovative sources of data that as we move further in the realm of smart communities, there are more and more sources of data that exist, but those have to be cleaned and refined so that we can actually use those sources of data to get better information out of. So as an example, we've got a bunch of speed studies going on where we're using all kinds of different speed sensors that are already in vehicles in different ways to try to understand speeding behavior on all the roads in a network at the same time. Similarly, we work on ways to get information out to people. So if we're trying to overcome these barriers, we have to be able to understand people and to get information out to them. So I work with app developers to create usable apps, reliable sources for them to actually be able to get the information that they need, and providing multiple means of access, which I won't go into here, but the last thing that I want to show is an image that Chris created for a presentation that we did a number of years ago, and I still think it's pretty applicable to explain what it is that we do in my lab, the Urban Transportation Information Lab. We take city and regional institutions' data, we put that into different apps and services and databases, and then we try to turn that into information that can go out to members of the community so that they can make better choices about transportation. So in this picture, we say transit and bike riders because that's been a large part of our focus, but I want you to think broadly about right-sized vehicles and collective vehicles. We also develop things where we're trying to take data from citizens and put it into those same services and provide that back out to those citizens through crowdsourcing means, or provide it to those institutions like cities and regions so that they have better information about how people are traveling and how they might want to travel in the future. So this is a great image that I still stand by as how we're trying to bring the data and the information together and sort of the overall scope of what my lab does. So with that, I'm going to close. Here's my Twitter handle and my email address to take questions after the webinar. But I think we have about 15 minutes left to take questions right now.
Thank you so much, Kari. That was incredibly informative. It makes me very optimistic, but a little concerned about some of the problems that you pointed out. I had never thought about these zero occupancy trips. That kind of blew my mind. I thought we were headed toward a fantastic, wonderful, autonomous future, but getting all these cars that are still going to be driving around without people in them might even make it worse. So that's very fascinating insight. So again, thank you for your presentation. Like Kari said, we have some time here to take your questions. We'll take your written questions. You can use the chat area here in the BlueJeans app to submit those written questions. Currently, we don't have any in the queue. Oh, here goes one. Perfect. Excellent. So this is a long one. So give us a second to read through this.
Greg, you might have to help me.
Yes, I'll read it for
Okay.
you. This is Kevin. He's a graduating undergrad CS student at GT, very strong advocate for multimodal transit. You listed several new technologies that are improving the quality of multimodal transportation, however, see legal policies and social behavior being a larger barrier.
Yeah.
Legal policies still continue to not promote multimodal transportation, and the behavior of the average person has not shifted much based on his observations. How can we use technology to solve the political, legal, social issues for us to actually be able to see rapid improvements and increased usage of multimodal transportation? And what can I do personally to help?
That's a great question. I think you bring up, he says it as legal issues, and then what was the other half? Social, sort of behavioral types of things. So what I point to in this whole world, and this is not research that we're in particular doing, but I think is kind of the crux of the problem. If we're going to promote this kind of system, we need both carrots and sticks. And this is an analogy that's been used for a long, long time, right? You think of the horse and there's, the carrot hanging in front of him, but you're kind of nudging him along and behind at the same time. So I see a lot of the things is what my research team is doing today is the carrot part of this. We have to get transit to be working the way that it should. We have to improve bikeability so that people are not afraid to be out there on, a bike or a scooter or any of these kinds of micromobility sized devices. But at the same time, we have to be putting policies in place so that people are encouraged not to be making the choices as they're making them today. And so Greg talked about kind of the scariness of that autonomous future. The way that I think we get ourselves out of that is particularly through pricing. So there are terms that we use in our industry a lot, like congestion pricing, those types of things. So technology can be used so that we're paying on more of a per mile basis instead of the way that we do today, where it doesn't really matter where you're driving, and you may pay some gas taxes, but they're not very high actually in the scheme of things. And you may, if you have an electric vehicle or something like that, you're now getting around paying those gas taxes. So we're looking towards these futures where you would pay on a per mile basis, and it becomes really, really important as we look towards driverless vehicles that something like my trip to Chattanooga, that's priced appropriately so that I'm not going to do that. And we also have to price it appropriately so that somebody is not going to be willing to send that vehicle back to park at their house because they're not going to want that zero occupant trip to occur. So using technology to understand how many people are in a vehicle, where that vehicle is traveling, as scary as it sounds, there are ways that we can measure that with it still staying anonymous, so that somebody's not keeping track of you particularly, but they are keeping track of the amount of travel that you're doing, so that can be priced accordingly. And those are the kinds of things that I think have to happen to incentivize people to be making better choices.
And that's a perfect lead into our next question, which essentially has to do with data privacy.
Oh, yeah.
And the question is kind of, what are your thoughts on these emerging open data sources and the fights that private companies are starting in the data sharing world?
Yeah. So this was a big problem. I started to think a lot more about this when Chris and I were working on the Cycle Atlanta program. We were essentially creating an app similar to things that other people had done, but because they were a private company, they could access people's data without even really thinking about it, as long as a user was willing to click through. And they've got this data sharing agreement that people often, they're just clicking a button and willing to share their data in all kinds of ways. We, because we're researchers at a university, had to go through a human subjects process and explain exactly how it was we were going to use this data. And many of these companies don't have to go through the same sort of thing. But in the process, by virtue of us having to do this, it enabled me to be able to think a little bit better about how we could make choices so that we weren't accidentally exposing our users to something that we didn't want them to be exposed to. So what Chris and I did was we had a few different ways where, as we were making this data public, we would take off the first couple hundred feet from each trip. So we couldn't see exactly where somebody was coming to or from to track that individual person, but you could still see their entire trajectory. Other things that companies will do that we've worked with to try to get similar data to this, they aggregate it up so that you're only looking at trips that, a group of people have taken. So which segments of a roadway network have the most trips on them, and how many trips are taking place, but it's not back at the individual. And, it's fairly easy, given the intelligence behind a lot of these companies that could be sharing these types of data, for them to look at ways to keep it anonymous so that people's privacy is protected. The difficulty is somebody knows the extent of those actual trips. And so, keeping those systems closed in ways that all of that is protected and only the right people are accessing it is key. That's not what I do. So I feel like I'm kind of kicking the can down the road and putting the problem in somebody else's court. But I think it's pretty important that we figure out ways to do this, because having access to that kind of data is really fundamental to our ability to build a better transportation system.
Excellent. Thanks, Kari. We've had a lot of questions come in, so thank you so much, everyone, for asking these questions. One individual had the opportunity to go ride the Ollie autonomous vehicle at Peachtree Corners.
Yeah.
So he's wondering what your take on the adoption of these emerging technologies is kind of in the near term, and if we're close, and what do you see as barriers to make that adoption happen?
So it's been a couple of years since I've ridden one. From the discussions that I've had with folks who've done so more recently, it hasn't changed vastly since the few years. Once upon a time, I was a regular attendee at a large conference that it's not coming in my head right now, but where this technology was shown off a fair bit. And I had the experience of riding there. What I saw was when it's in a closed situation, so in these closed campus situations, where it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. You may have a few things that the vehicle is reacting to. It's able to move at a reasonable speed. In situations where it's sort of anything can happen, you can imagine, like, if we put this type of vehicle on Georgia Tech's campus, that kind of situation where you have pedestrians coming at you and bikes and scooters and all kinds of things surrounding you. In that type of situation, the ability of the vehicle to sense everything around it and react to all of those things made it such that it moved so slowly that I was walking faster than the vehicle. I've been assured that, this is going to improve, but the question is, in the near term, how much is it going to improve, right? At some point, maybe we're going to get there. The belief is that we're getting there. But in the near term, what we're seeing is, these vehicles can fit in certain elements, but looking at that as the best way to have collective transportation, where we're really trying to get a large group of people as fast as possible from one location to another, that type of autonomous shuttle is really not going to do it, only if it's in like a closed situation. What I'd like to point out to people when we talk about driverless vehicles, we've had driverless vehicles for a very, very long time in the public transportation system. All you have to do is go to Paris and ride Line 1, which has existed for a very long time. Well, Line 1 has, but even as an autonomous vehicle. So when it's in that kind of closed condition where, there are tracks that nobody is going to be on, you don't need a driver of that train. We have the technology for that vehicle to be able to drive itself from one place to another, but it's only able to do so in a very, very fast environment when you know that it doesn't have to sense a bunch of things around it that are going to slow it down. One of the things that Mike Hunter and I have been talking about for a while and kind of working towards proposing research on is understanding better, as we get in the near term, how people are going to take advantage of these vehicles, and the fact that with these types of driverless vehicles, if they're moving slow like that, the late adopters of these things are going to be the folks who want to be cutting that vehicle off at all turns, because they know that vehicle is programmed to be safer than they're going to drive. So, these are bigger picture issues. It's not quite what I do, but it's a great question.
Fascinating. Yeah, other people are asking similar type of questions, how these advances in technology are going to just make our world, different, our transportation world different. One person was asking about 5G and how that's going to impact these transportation technologies. Another person was asking about electric vehicles and how that's going to impact our transportation sector and specifically help us reduce carbon emissions. And then the last question, I'm hitting you all with all of these at the same time, was what can citizens do to help their communities open up their data so that communities that maybe don't have access to a OneBusAway type of application or some kind of similar application could maybe get that information from their city, encourage that city to open up the data so that some kind of application like that could actually be made and be used.
Sure. So that's probably the best one for me to talk about, but in the interest of time, let me see if I can hit the electric briefly, and then we'll talk about that one. So keep in mind, electric vehicles, there's some amazing researchers at Georgia Tech that are working on, different types of batteries and looking at that as a power source and how we do these things better, right? More sustainably, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to solve certain problems that I talked about at the beginning, like when we looked at those local emissions. But we have to get our energy from somewhere, even if it's electrically powered. There are power plants somewhere that are producing that electricity. And there are more sustainable ways that we can be doing that. But a lot of places, it's not quite there yet, where we're doing this in really, really great ways where, when we look at the global pollution problems, that electric is really taking those away. But there are innovations that are getting us there so that I'm pretty reasonably comfortable with the fact that, that's going to change a lot over the next 20, 30 or more years. But keep in mind that even as we move towards electric, some of those situations that I talked about, that space allocation piece, we talked about how driverless is not going to change it. Electric's not going to change it either. So that space allocation piece really comes down to that collective piece that we have to have this kind of shared mobility in order to answer that piece of the problem. So folks in my industry talk about the 3 revolutions, and all of those revolutions need to be taking place for us to be using technology well. And we can't just assume that shared piece is going to happen. That's the point of my research and what it is that I try to do. So in the last minute, let me try to talk about the open data piece, how communities can work with their governments in order to get them to open up the data. A number of years ago, when we first started working in this area, one of the big things was that governments were looking towards, can we actually sell this data? Can we monetize it? I think we've finally gotten over that hurdle where that's no longer the direction that they're going. When I first started working with MARTA, their thought was, can we actually use this as a source of revenue? Because most transit agencies need many, many sources of revenue because they're so poorly funded. But I think now we've gotten to the point where what a lot of it is just the resources within those communities. I think a lot of cities and towns want to be able to open this data up, but having the time and the knowledge in order to clean it up to the point where they could, that this data is not sitting there in a way that, even if they put it out there and opened it up, who's going to actually access it because there's no metadata to go with it and things like that. So I think a lot of the hesitancy is in that piece of it. So that's a way that Georgia Tech plays a really big role, is educating people in lots of fields. We're doing more and more outside of computer science to make sure that students in all disciplines know how to actually work with data, so that they can actually, do the processing and whatnot that's needed so that, somebody who's working for a city government or a department of transportation, that they're able to do the same things that historically we were relying on folks in computer science to be doing. So, data processing and analytics and whatnot. I'm trying to think, what can they do as somebody, I think just making the community aware that there are people out there who would actually work with this data. And that's another way that Georgia Tech, I think, helps, because we often have student groups who want to be doing projects and they're asking for these data sources so that they can do something innovative with it. So I guess this sounds like, we planned this, but I'll turn it back over to Greg with the idea that the whole point of this is that through things like the smart communities, I mean, we're not just selling this piece, this is something we fundamentally believe in, is that this is the kind of thing where, partnering the researchers with the communities and with the students, this is a way that we can help the communities understand what's out there and how their data can actually be used through, the means that we have at places like Georgia Tech and our ability to sort of pass that on to the communities. So I'm going to close with that.
Thanks, Kari. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say that we've been to a lot of communities that have a lot of data that sits in databases and data banks and spreadsheets, and nobody can see it except for one or two people. And opening up that data would allow incredible improvements in efficiencies for these communities. So, but it's the expertise. It's finding the person that can come in and help open up that data to the rest of the world in a way that can be useful. So that is a challenge that a lot of communities are facing.
Yeah.
So Kari, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today and educating us in this transportation space. Again, I will let everybody know that we do have 2 more webinars coming up as part of our Georgia Smart webinar series here in 2020, and those dates again are January 24th and April 14th. So thank you everyone for attending today, and you all have a great afternoon.